Recently, an online high-stakes reg that goes by the screen name Fiilismies made a thread on 2plus2 accusing the #1 cash game player in the world, LLinusLLove, of cheating through the use of solver assistance while playing online. As part of his evidence, he posted a few hands which purported to show Linus taking obscure lines that only a solver and no human would likely use on a consistent basis. In this video, we'll be examining these hands to forensically investigate whether Linus's play can likely only be explained by the use of solver assistance, or if instead his play could possibly be attributable to something else, such as a deep understanding of GTO principles. So in the first game, we are three-handed with the blinds $100, $200. OTB Red Baron raises on the button to 475 and Linus 3-bets in the small blind with kings. True Teller 4-bets to 5k with 10s and OTB Red Baron folds. Linus then 5-bets to 13k and True Teller calls. The flop comes king 5-5 and Linus continues with a quarter pot bet. Before getting started with the analysis, I should mention that I'm not quite sure what Fiilismies was using for his ranges, but we will be using ranges obtained from Range Converter that have set, stack, and bet sizings, which will not exactly replicate the hands in this video. Also, we should keep in mind that each individual's actual ranges may differ widely from person to person, especially for a 5-bet pot. And since the solver's results will usually be very sensitive when dealing with extremely compressed ranges, the analysis presented in this video should be taken with a grain of salt. Given these ranges, we see that Linus's flop bet is consistent with virtually 100% of the solver strategy for the entire range. And with this king high paired in rainbow board, I think most would agree that this should be virtually an auto c-bet spot in Linus's shoes. Although both players' ranges are extremely tight, this board will favor Linus as the pre-flop aggressor, since he should have an advantage in particular in full houses and overpairs. True Teller calls and the turn brings a 10 of hearts, giving both Linus and True Teller full houses, and Linus decides to check, which we see the solver is doing with 100% frequency. So would this be considered an obscure line that most humans could not arrive at without assistance? I would argue no. As we have mentioned a number of times in past videos, in most scenarios, PO Solver will allocate some strong value hands into its checking range to create balance and to protect its checking lines. So how does PO Solver choose which value hands to check with? Well, in my experience, 3 of the most important considerations in this regard are 1. Protection, 2. Blocker effects, and 3. SPR. Generally speaking, if a hand requires more protection, the solver will often be more inclined to bet the hand to avoid being outdrawn in runouts. In this case, Linus has the essential nuts, so protection is not a concern. Additionally, the solver will be more likely to check a hand if it has significant card removal effects to the value combos or strong draws in the villain's range. In this case, it's hard to think of many other combinations in Linus's range that have stronger blocking properties than King of Hearts, King of Spades, given this flop. With a king on the board and 2 kings in Linus's hand, all of these King X combos in True Teller's range are heavily blocked, leaving very few hands that will be able to sustain any significant bet, other than perhaps pocket aces or some ace-high flush draws or pocket 10s, as True Teller has here. And finally, when SPRs are very low, generally the solver's propensity to build the pot with stronger hands prior to the river will be decreased. Here the SPR is less than 1, so Linus could easily choose to shove either here or on the river, and given that he has the nuts, opting to wait until the river to allow True Teller to hit a possible straight or flush appears to be a completely rational decision. True Teller bets 20% with his full house, and Linus simply calls behind, which again is both consistent with the solver strategy as well as the principles we just discussed, which justifies Linus simply calling behind. The river brings the Queen of Clubs and Linus donk shoves. So as we can see, Pew is actually advising to continue checking, which is likely because the solver will often lean towards continuing with the same line it has taken on prior streets, especially when it has a strong hand and the villain begins betting for you. However, this is a spot where my sim and Fiilismies' sims differ, which is likely a product of the conflicting ranges we've chosen. It appears that Fiilismies' ranges are more suited connector heavy, whereas my ranges are more ace X and king X heavy. I think this discrepancy alone should give us pause on relying heavily on these solutions to prove anything, since they are based on the assumption that we know the player's exact ranges, which we don't. But putting that aside, if we try to think through Linus's decision logically, knowing his whole cards, is shoving here after checking the turn really a stretch? Well, we know that Linus has the nuts, so of course he wants to build the pot. And if he decided to check and True Teller simply checked behind, Linus would have lost out on major value. Additionally, the Queen is a card that should hit True Teller's top-heavy compressed range, which makes it more likely that he has a number of holdings that should be calling a less than full pot bet on the river. Right, we see that according to Pio, all of these combos should be calling the shove, including aces, ace-king, ace-jack, which now makes a straight, king-10, and trips. However, on the other hand, if Linus decided not to bet and checked instead, we see that ace-king, king-10, and some of these pocket pairs would have simply checked behind. In hand number 2, we have Linus and True Teller battling heads up, this time playing 200-400. True Teller raises in the small blind to 1.1k, and Linus 3-bets with ace-10 suited. True Teller then 4-bets to 12.8k, and Linus calls. And here are the ranges we will assume for each player, which come from Range Converter's 100 big blind heads-up solutions. The flop comes king, 5, jack, all spades, Linus checks, True Teller bets quarter pot, and Linus calls. So Fiilismies questioned Linus's call here, but is it really that unusual? Well, we see that in the face of this small bet, the solver is defending over 70% of its range. We see that virtually any made hand, except certain lower pairs, and virtually any draw, except some of these weaker gut shots, are defending. Yes, this is a very dangerous board in a 4-bet pot, but since we are heads up, the ranges should be relatively wider, which should cause the solver to defend looser in general as well. With that in mind, I think Linus's call here should not be too surprising. Pio will defend small flop bets with most of its draws, even on very unfavorable boards, in order to avoid being exploited by an auto c-bet strategy. In contrast, we see that if True Teller had bet larger, around half pot, nearly 100% of these ace-10 combos will fold. The turn brings a 2 of clubs and both players check, and the river is the Queen of Hearts, which gives Linus a straight, but both players check again. As we can see, in our sim, the solver actually leads out with a bet with high frequency, which makes sense given True Teller's check behind on the turn. Right, if we modify the sim and force True Teller to bet small on the turn with Linus calling behind, we see that the solver will continue the passive play in Linus's shoes on the river, despite having the option to donk. So given that Linus decided to check on the river, why did Fiilismies use this hand as evidence of Linus's cheating? Well, it appears that Fiilismies actually used 3-bet instead of 4-bet ranges in his initial sim, and then corrected it in a later post, which confirmed that Linus should have actually bet here according to Pio. So Linus actually deviated here from the solver, and may have been playing more of an exploitative bluff-catching strategy against True Teller, who is known to be quite aggressive. So in the final game, we are again 3-handed, and this time True Teller raises on the button with queens, and Linus defends the big blind with pocket 4s. Given that this is a single raised button versus big blind spot, we should expect the preflop ranges to be pretty standardized here. The flop comes deuce, 3, ace. Linus checks, True Teller bets a bit less than half pot, and Linus raises 3.2x. Here we see that the solver is primarily simply calling with Linus's pair and gut shot. Button versus big blind is a spot where you will often see a lot of check raising by the solver, since both ranges should be relatively wide, but on this board in particular, we see that True Teller likely has a significant range advantage, since both players should have straights and 2 pairs here, but only True Teller is likely to have top set and the strongest aces in this single raised pot. That being said, we see that the EV differences between calling and raising are quite close when holding the 4 of clubs, so either play should generally be reasonable. The turn brings a 5 of clubs, giving Linus a straight, and he checks. Here we see that the solver is mixing its play with this combo and with most of its range. So would checking a turn straight after check raising the flop be considered an unusual line? Well, I don't know what the general population would tend to do in this spot, but what I do know is that I've seen Linus take a similar line before. In my video analyzing hands played between Linus and Charlie Correll at the Triton High Roller Series in London, there was a hand where, similar to this one, Charlie opened on the button and Linus defended with King-Queen in the big blind. Charlie continued on the flop and was check-raised by Linus with top pair. The turn brought a king, giving Linus 2 pair, and he interestingly decided to check. So unless Linus has some type of cochlear implant feeding him solver advice, it appears that this particular strategy is in fact one of the tools in Linus's arsenal to protect his check, raise, check line. Right? If you are check raising anywhere near GTO frequencies, it means that you will be check raising some garbage hands like gut shots or double backdoors or bottom pair, with the goal of forcing your opponent to fold and punishing players that over c-bet. However, if the villain doesn't fold, then in many situations the hero will be forced to check on the next street to avoid veering towards overaggression. And in order to protect this line, it makes sense from a GTO perspective to incorporate some stronger holdings as a check on the turn after a check raise on the flop, with hands that don't require as much protection and or that block the villain's continuing range. For example, in this case, Linus may decide to continue to bet when not holding the flush blocker, but to check when holding the flush blocker. However, although the EVs between betting and checking are close, the solver is mostly betting with the club, so why did Fiilismies choose this as evidence of Linus's foul play? Well, it appears again that he may have actually run the sim incorrectly and switched the positions of the players, resulting in a different strategy which showed more checking on the turn. The river brings the 9 of hearts and Linus bets pot, which seems like a reasonable play to reclaim the value lost by checking the turn. Trueteller apparently realizes at this point that he may be behind, and he raises big, holding the queen of clubs. Interestingly, given the apparent strength of Trueteller's 4.2x raise over Linus's full pot bet, the solver is actually folding most of its straights in Linus's shoes, even when holding the 4 of clubs. But Linus calls with the flush blocker, again perhaps based on an exploitative read of Trueteller's aggressive tendencies. So after reviewing these hands, can we say with definitive certainty whether or not Linus is a cheater? Well, not really, but I will say this. For one, the hands presented by Fiilismies in and of themselves are definitely not evidence of Linus using assistance. For one, a number of the lines Linus took were actually inconsistent with the solver strategy, and the spots where his play was consistent with the solver were not obscure and could be simply explained through an understanding of core GTO principles. And on top of this, 2 out of the 3 sims ran by Fiilismies appeared to have actually been incorrectly set up. Additionally, having analyzed a number of hands played by Linus in live tournament settings, although it's a small sample size, my view was that Linus's play was quite consistent with the solver with 2 exceptions. One, in certain hands I reviewed, he used strategies that differed frequency-wise from the solver's solutions. However, in many of these spots, the EV difference between Linus's actions and the solver's actions were close, which in my opinion is much more important to focus on because frankly, it's possible that in some spots, PO solver's mixed frequencies may be arbitrary or possibly even wrong since it uses a number of abstractions and doesn't actually converge all the way to the equilibrium. In fact, if you run the same sims with the exact same variables on different solvers, you'll often find that while the solutions overall are close, there will often be significant discrepancies between the frequencies of mixed strategies. And the second scenario where I noticed significant deviations between Linus's live play and the solver strategies were in his final table tournament runs at the Triton London series. And in those videos, Linus did actually make a number of plays which resulted in significant EV loss compared to the solver's solutions. However, in order to understand how ICM was impacting the solver strategies, I also ran the same sims without ICM considerations, and interestingly, in most of those spots where Linus deviated from the ICM solutions, his play was actually eerily consistent with the non-ICM solutions. And to me, this was a clear indication of someone that has hardwired into his brain a very deep understanding of GTO principles from years of studying solver solutions for cash games. I'm not quite sure how much work Fiilismies actually does with solvers, but if he believes you learn from solvers by running sims for every possible spot and then memorizing all those solutions, I think he may be missing the point. Since there are an almost infinite number of possible decision points in the game of No Limit Hold'em, the goal in studying solvers should actually be to memorize as little as possible, and instead we should be focusing on uncovering the underlying principles that drive the GTO strategies, which then can be applied across different situations that we've never encountered before. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.